curious, deliberate. Somewhere inside a classified military archive in Beijing sits a document from the summer of 1951. It's a tactical intelligence briefing for Chinese company commanders, and it contains a warning no officer wanted to read. The orders were explicitly clear. Do not engage Australian positions at night. Avoid frontal assaults on their perimeters. Expect aggressive counterattacks, even when they are outnumbered. To understand why that specific warning was written, we have to look at the men it was written about. By early 1951, the 3rd Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment, or 3AR, was shipped to Korea. These were ordinary young men, many of them veterans who had already survived the Second World War. They were eager to buy houses, start families, and watch the cricket. The absolute last thing they wanted was another overseas conflict. So how did a forgotten group of 700 reluctant soldiers earn a special threat classification from a military force of hundreds of thousands? The situation they walked into was built on a massive intelligence failure. In the autumn of 1950, U.S. General Douglas MacArthur told the world the boys would be home by Christmas. He believed United Nations forces had completely shattered the North Korean army and chased them to the northern border. He was wrong by roughly 3 years and several 100,000 soldiers. Mao Zedong had watched the UN forces push north and decided China was entering the war with everything it had. Moving in absolute secrecy, marching at night and hiding in forests by day, more than 300,000 Chinese soldiers crossed the Yalu River completely undetected. When they struck, the UN line shattered. The Chinese spring offensive hit the South Korean 6th Division like a sledgehammer. 10,000 men dropped their weapons and ran south in a blind panic. Seeing this, American support units pulled back, some without orders, completely disintegrating the front. Within hours, a 10-kilometer gap was torn into the UN defense. Chinese forces poured through, funneling straight into a narrow corridor of hills called the Kapyong Valley. If you controlled Kapyong, you controlled the road south to Seoul. Somebody at UN command had to find a plug for the hole. The only available force was a handful of Commonwealth soldiers, including 700 Australian light infantrymen. Outgunned, they were ordered into the valley with instructions to hold the line and not retreat. Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Ferguson understood the weight of those orders. With the South Korean line in collapse and the Americans pulling back, his men were the only unit left. They were the cork in the bottle. If they failed to hold, the road to Seoul was open, and the war was effectively lost. As the sun went down on April 23rd, the valley filled up with noise. The Chinese attack was preceded by dozens of brass bugles and shrill whistles blown from every direction. It created a nerve-shredding wall of sound in the pitch black, designed to convince the defenders they were already surrounded. When the flares popped into harsh white light, the Australians saw a dark, undulating mass of humanity stretching back into the blackness, as far as the light could reach. Thousands of soldiers filled the corridor so densely, it created the visual effect of the valley floor itself shifting. Then, the one thing that shouldn't have happened, happened. A troop of American Sherman tanks had been positioned at the base of the hill to provide fire support. But as the Chinese began flowing around the lower slopes, the tank commander made a decision. Without radioing headquarters, without a warning shot, the tanks reversed onto the road and drove away, leaving the infantry entirely without armored support. The news traveled through the foxholes by field telephone and furious whispers. But Australian soldiers do not process betrayal with panic. They get angry, and then they get efficient. Sergeants quietly checked ammunition counts, redistributed grenades, and told the younger soldiers to stop wasting rounds on shadows. Survival was no longer about Allied strategy or combined arms. It shrank to a purely internal equation, the discipline of 700 against overwhelming isolation. The Chinese assault tactics relied on a brutal arithmetic. They sent endless waves of infantry uphill. The first wave threw stick grenades and fired from the hip to force the defenders to shoot, revealing exactly where their foxholes were. The second wave aimed directly at those newly identified weak points. It was an execution schedule designed to exhaust the defenders' finite ammunition. By midnight, the physical tools of the defense were failing. Bren machine guns warped from the heat of sustained fire. Rifle bolts fused shut with carbon fouling. Chinese soldiers breached the wire, and combat devolved into medieval hand-to-hand brawls in the dark, using rifle butts, entrenching shovels, and fists. Watching his perimeter collapse from the inside, the Australian commander made a truly desperate call. He requested a New Zealand artillery battery to drop high-explosive shells directly onto his own overrun positions. The men pressed their faces into the dirt, relying on blind trust that the Kiwi gunners could hit the enemy without wiping them out. The artillery sealed the breach, but the Chinese kept coming. By 4 a.m, the Australians had practically zero ammunition left. Grenades were gone, mortar rounds were gone. Some platoons had fewer than 5 bullets per man, and below them, thousands of Chinese troops were massing for a final, overwhelming push. With no bullets left, the sergeants passed down a 2-word order: fix bayonets. Ragged groups of Australians hauled themselves out of their foxholes and charged downhill into the darkness. It was a move that completely shattered the rhythm of the Chinese offensive. The attackers had spent the night fighting men who shot back. They were entirely unprepared for an enemy rushing at them with cold steel. Outnumbered 10-1 and stripped of their ammunition, the Australians chose to abandon their defenses and go on the offensive. They broke the momentum of a division using only cold steel and the element of surprise. By mid-morning, the aftermath was staggering. The Chinese 118th Division, which started the night 8,000 strong, was rendered combat ineffective, suffering up to 2,000 casualties. The Australian tally was just 32 men who did not come home from that hill. Those 18 hours of sustained violence bought the United Nations forces enough time to pull themselves together and establish a new defensive line. Because the Australians held the valley, the Chinese advance was blocked, and the vulnerable cityscape of Seoul was saved from a third capture. When the order to withdraw finally came on April 25th, Anzac Day, they did it on their own terms. They refused to scramble or run. They walked off that hill by companies in daylight formation, carrying every single wounded mate with them. It was a clear statement of defiance. We are leaving because we were told to, and we are taking our people with us. If Kapyong had fallen, military historians calculate Chinese forces would have reached the capital within 48 hours, potentially ending the war on Beijing's terms. Because those 700 men held a hill in 1951, a free, democratic nation of 51 million people exists today. While the Battle of Kapyong faded into a quiet corner of Australian memory, it remained a focal point for Chinese military intelligence. That classified briefing in Beijing stands as the final word on the night the 3rd Battalion refused to break.